Certamen, Eternus, Part 2. Eternal Contest. As he passed through the kitchen, he encountered the delicious smell of the cake the girls were baking for supper that night and shook his head. Ever since the cold weather had set in, they had been baking up a storm, so much so that Anne and Lisa had to carefully regulate the amount of supplies they used up, lest they run short. Food was regularly coming into the markets now. Miguel had even managed to reopen his store, so it wasn't like you couldn't restock what was used, but it was very expensive and getting more so by the week. There was much speculation that the dollar revaluation scheduled to happen next month would relieve the spiraling inflation, but John wasn't so sure. In any case, they were being very careful with their food stores until matters settled down and they could replenish what they used. He passed through the dining room where Anne was going over Brittany's algebra work and explaining how to work the word problem she'd given her. He was quite happy to leave them to it and grateful he didn't have to try to explain it himself. Never was any good at them word problems. Kids nowadays run circles around me with a pen and paper. Oh boy, not today. In the living room, he opened the door on the stove and stoked the fire, then stood for a few moments warming his hands. To no one in particular, he said, "This cold is really starting to get to my hands. I wonder if I'm starting to get a little arthritis or rheumatism." When he had sufficiently warmed himself, he put on his hat again and headed back out the door. On the back porch, he saw scattered fat flakes of wet snow falling. Well, ain't that just great? He stepped off and crunched across the yard towards his splitting block where he'd been producing stove wood before he heard the commotion with the goats. He picked up his splitting maul, then looked toward the sky, a fat snowflake landing on his face. It was a time that snow in Florida was a big deal. Now it's just another pain in the ass. Well, it's not a snowstorm, at least. With a grunt, he swung the maul and split a round of oak. Swing after swing, the pile of split wood gradually began to grow. Growing tired of the movement, he put the maul down and piled the billets into the wheelbarrow to take them into the small woodshed to be stacked. When he returned, he found the splitting stump in a coat of white. Looking around, he noticed snow was beginning to stick and deepen everywhere, and that he could now barely see the far pasture fence. Damned if we aren't going to get the heaviest snowfall I've ever seen in Florida. His shoulder muscles protested when he picked up the maul again, so he stood for a moment with the tool on his shoulder and looking out across the pasture and orchard. The snow steadily increased, and he watched it fascinated. A breeze began to slant the falling snow slightly, but also sending penetrating fingers of cold searching his collar, sleeves, and pants cuffs. Sure doesn't take much wind to make itself felt when it's 20 degrees outside. 25 degrees, whatever. He muttered to himself, "Clouds getting so thick that it's going to be too dark to see soon. Think I'll do the sensible thing and call it a day." He laid the maul in the barrow and picked up the sledgehammer and wedges to go with it and took it all into the shop. He stopped by the barn on his way out to make sure that all was in order. One of the girls would be out after supper to milk. On his way to the house, the snow seemed to be falling even heavier and was not seriously beginning to pile up on any surface not steep enough to shed it. If it were drier, the wind would probably be pushing it around more. Temperature drops any more and it won't be wet for long. A gust of wind seemed to thrust itself down his neck. He stepped onto the porch and eyed the thermometer, which read 22 degrees. Shaking his head, he opened the door and stepped into the fragrant warmth of the kitchen. Heather looked up from the cake she was icing and said, "Hi, Uncle John. Supper won't be ready for another half an hour or so. There's hot chocolate on the stove if you'd like some." With a grin, he replied, "I do believe I will." He poured himself a cup and went through the dining room where Anne, Brittany, and Melinda were working on their Spanish. "Hola, Señora Horn," he said. "Und los niños." His wife wrinkled her nose at him and said, "Sounds like you need to be cracking a book yourself." "Und los niños, indeed." He laughed as he passed into the living room. Glancing at the mantel clock, he picked up his frequency list for his shortwave receiver to decide what he might have a chance of catching. Not really being dark yet, he thought Voice of America might be his best chance. Carefully punching the frequency number, he caught the end of an interview seemingly concerned with grain production in Central Europe, but it ended before he could determine who was being interviewed or where. The news came on next. At the NATO meeting in Brussels today, tensions remained high as Turkey adamantly refused to recall its troops from northern Iraq. Satellite and reconnaissance drones revealed Turkish army troops in active and open conflict with forces of the two major Kurdish groups that control the northern Iraqi no-fly zone and disorganized units of the Iraqi army. Turkish military personnel spokesmen have repeatedly stated that Turkey will not allow a Kurdish free state to form in the chaos that Iraq now represents and will use whatever military force it must in order to carry this out. U.S. and NATO officials are negotiating with Turkey at this moment to find a workable solution. Units of the Syrian army are also alleged to have crossed the Iraqi frontier, but no confirming evidence is available at this time. Both Turkey and Syria have long-standing concerns about the formation of a Kurdish state. Also in Iraq, units of the U.S. military and Marines are continuing to make good northern progress along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in their drive to reach Baghdad and link up with the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions now occupying that city. An-Nashina, Al-Basra, and Qasr have fallen in the last week, and the cities of Al-Qut and An-Najaf are expected to fall within the next 48 hours. Representatives of the Russian Federation strongly protested this use of military American force to intervene in what they contend is strictly an internal Iraqi matter. Meanwhile, American military intelligence continues to report a buildup of military forces and supplies along the Iranian border. President Bush has been in telephone contact with Iranian President Khatami, allegedly warning him not to allow Iranian forces to cross the border. In Latin America, the nation of Colombia seems to be sinking deeper into civil war as FARC forces are now said to be in control of half the city of Bogota after the failure of the second counteroffensive by the Colombian army to dislodge the rebels from their control of the business areas of the city. In the U.S., fresh reports of rage along the southwestern border. Uncle John, supper's ready. Heather's voice cut through the radio. Killed 22, wounded. Hours later, 3 Mexican nationals were lynched in the town of Click. John turned off the radio and stood up. Would it hurt them to broadcast some good news once in a while? These people could drive Pollyanna into despair. Stepping through the door, he spied an elegant chocolate frosted cake on the counter and then said, well, at least there's something to live for. All right. Good night. Thank you. God bless.